is there really a standard method that police agencies tend to use to prioritize their offenders? And surprise, surprise, there actually is no rigorous standardized method. The paper that I ended up writing for the IACA struck a balance between taking into account clinical knowledge, officer experience, and the intelligence that might not be gathered in police data, but combining it with rigorous method.
What's going on, analysts? Welcome to another episode of our All About Analysis YouTube channel, where we interview guests involved in policing and public safety for their insights into all things crime analysis. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's guest is John Ng, an IACA certified law enforcement analyst for the Saskatoon Police Service in Western Canada, serving as a Special Constable. John is the director of the Canadian Society of Evidence-Based Policing. He has a degree in criminal justice and psychology, and he currently serves as the chair of the Publications Committee at the IACA. John, thanks for some of your time and welcome to the channel.
Thanks for the opportunity, Manny.
You've been a busy guy lately. I've listened to your interviews on Neuro Knowledge podcast with Nicholas Roy. It's about time we got you on the channel.
I'm very happy to be here.
Give us an idea of what a Special Constable is and perhaps your current role at the Saskatoon Police.
For sure. So Special Constables, like we had briefly chatted about, I'm not certain if it's too familiar in the US, but definitely within my police department, they've got a few roles, some in communications and some in our detention area. But more recently, over the past 8 years or so, we started creating special constable positions for analytical purposes. Part of the reason why was to ensure consistency, to have a crime analyst to be in certain positions for a longer period of time, because historically it's been constables who end up switching out after every 5 years or so, when really for most people it takes about 5 years to just get comfortable in their position. So they just decided to recognize that it might be better to have a special constable in there instead of a constable. And so just in terms of my role with the Saskatoon Police Service, like you mentioned, I've been with them for over 10 years now. I first started out as a research coordinator in their planning and research section. Then 2 years later, I became their first patrol analyst, and that essentially morphed into the divisional crime analyst position that we have now. So most of my work right now versus the work that I had done in planning is very much tactical. So I help a lot of patrol members, executive staff, administrative staff, identify what their priorities are in the city, what problems there are, what trends and patterns there are. And then we kind of brainstorm in terms of what we do to move forward with that. And so part of my role is not just identifying what the problems are and analyzing them, of course, so not just identifying them, analyzing them, but also helping them to kind of figure out based off of the data what might be good solutions. And with my background in evidence-based policing, then that part of that comes down to understanding and implementing kind of research into what I do. And then, of course, the last key piece of kind of what we typically do is evaluating whether the initiative that we had done was effective or not. So I give them feedback, an objective one, in terms of whether the initiative was effective, because we ultimately want to see if what we're doing is something that we should replicate down the road.
Tell me about your daily crime analysis routine. Give us a sense of what your day looks like.
Yeah, so my day-to-day type of work is my agency tends to follow the ComStat approach. So our work on a day-in, day-out basis, the first thing in the morning is creating our 24-hour daily report, which basically looks at incidences that happened over the past 24 hours. The benefit of that, and I think a lot of analysts would say the same thing, it's the same situation as reading reports on every single day as part of your job to basically try to identify trends and patterns and hotspots and people that administration should be knowing about. So yeah, that's kind of my day-to-day type of stuff. And then there's kind of odd projects that need to get done. But then in some cases, every few weeks or so, we need to prepare for reports like ComStat reports. So part of that includes summarizing kind of the initiatives that we had kind of worked on, and then identifying whether or not any of the actions that we had taken was actually effective, and then explaining kind of based off of the current statistics whether or not there's something that's new kind of popping up and whether we should switch gears or not. Obviously, that's on an ongoing kind of basis, but in reality, every agency should really be looking at a few strategic priorities, especially at a divisional level, and then trying to crunch through that throughout the year. If not, then they should focus on some of the more kind of tactical issues. For instance, if there's like a major crime series that's going on right now, we need to address it. Otherwise, we really need to move forward in terms of what we do strategically for that division.
How involved are you with criminal investigators?
To answer that question, for the past 8+ years or so, I've been working with our break and enter unit, and it's been a really, really good partnership. We ended up striking a committee, a break and enter strategy committee, 8 years ago. And ever since then, I've been the main analyst there. And now we've kind of grown a little bit more with a couple more analysts, which has been fantastic. But my initial role there was in terms of like summarizing kind of what the trends and patterns were in terms of break and enter and providing a few names here and there and trying to gather some of that intel. But we recognized over time that really the subject matter experts were the break and enter investigators and the detective sergeant who is running that unit. The role that the analysts have in the partnership that we have right now is maintaining not only, and this is something that I'm very proud about working on and developing, is our priority offender management program. And essentially what that is that as we go through different crime series, as we're potentially like identifying them, developing intelligence, we start identifying individuals that we really need to focus in on. So we manage them to some level. And the detective sergeant, focuses on, whether the person's got conditions. As the analyst, we develop intelligence on the person. We either push that out through criminal intelligence or criminal investigations to their investigators, or we send that back to patrol. So the other main thing for us in the past couple of years has really been developing the strategy team towards more like intelligence-based policing. So instead of just talking about, who should we go out and arrest, we really talk about justifying as to why we should go out and prioritize that individual to say, you know what, this person is very much a priority because they're involved in, 30 break and enters. This is the intel behind them. This is who they're working with. This is where they live, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really where myself and two of my other colleagues are really supplementing the work of our investigators, and the partnership between the two of us has been absolutely incredible. It's been leaps and bounds compared to where we were before, and what we're doing in terms of our partnership right now, it's actually rippling across the whole service. So we're setting a standard in terms of what we're doing.
I'm intrigued about your priority offender management. What criteria do you use to actually score your offenders?
That's actually a really, really good question. So I was working actually with the Iaca Standards, Methods, and Technology Committee when I started getting interested in the priority offender management process, because at the very beginning of the break and enter strategy team, the way that we initially identified who our main priority offenders were basically through gut sense. And over time, I gradually kind of thought, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so I had set forward a survey through the Iaca membership and the listserv to try to figure out, is there really a standard method that police agencies tend to use to prioritize their offenders? And surprise, surprise, there actually is no rigorous standardized method. So a few years back, I wrote a paper for them, a white paper, and it was pretty fascinating because part of that took literature from corrections where they really do risk assessments. And in that sense, I think that's hugely beneficial. That being said, the paper that I ended up writing for the IACA struck a balance between taking into account clinical knowledge, so like officer experience and the intelligence that might not be gathered in police data, but combining it with like rigorous methods. So some of the approaches might be through, risk assessment scores. The one that I'm actually kind of working on right now is about violent risk assessments. And we're developing a tool right now And the exciting thing behind that is that I'm working with our clinical psychologists to develop that tool. So we've got like an evidence base behind it. And so the approach that we had used for part of the break and enter strategy team really wasn't rigorous in the sense that, we had metrics that we would be identifying that's based off of research evidence. That being said, though, we did use almost like an intelligence-led approach to prioritizing our offenders. So it wasn't like we were picking names out of the sky. It was really based off of investigators' experiences and their knowledge.
You've been an analyst now for over 10 years. What have been your 3 biggest challenges in crime analysis, and how have you been able to overcome them?
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, I've been working in law enforcement analysis for over 10 years now. And to be quite honest, like I've seen a number of changes and really, really good changes. I mean, the fact that I'm involved in the Canadian Society of Evidence-Based Policing. Dr. Laura Huey started it up only a few years back. So, I mean, really, it in my perspective, it's starting to change. And hopefully I'm part of like spearheading portions of that. But part of my work, in addition to, doing my day-to-day crime analysis work, is really understanding like the research background with respect to our discipline. And I think that that's really, really important to not only understand what we do on a day-in-day basis and become a better analyst, but really take a step back to figure out, what are researchers finding out about our discipline. Part of the reason why this is really, really important is because it identifies some of these barriers. But in addition to that, it might give us opportunities to become more evidence-based in terms of what we're doing. Because really, like the analytical methods that we end up using, it's been passed on, time over time over time. But really, like, we haven't really figured out gaps in terms of like where we are in terms of our training. So in terms of some of the, challenges that I've kind of faced throughout my entire career, and I'm not saying that this is just specifically for my agency, I'm seeing it in the research literature, that I'm seeing, and it's surprising to not only see. I had thought for a minute that, at the very beginning of my career, I was very, very frustrated being a junior analyst, never coming into policing. And I just got into policing. I thought, wow, this is super frustrating to work in a policing culture. And then I go to Iaca conferences and I'm hearing the same thing. And I thought, reading through literature, that, it was maybe an American and UK phenomenon. But Dr. Carrie Sanders out of Laurier University, like she's doing international research, including looking at some of the barriers for Canadian analysts, and they're the exact same things. So they're talking about things like, gaps in data quality. So I've helped to kind of research a little bit on that. Talking about the division between civilian and sworn members, and the legitimacy that civilian crime analysts have, and the ability for them to influence police culture. Definitely training is one piece of it, and one of the reasons why that a lot of researchers and academics recognize that analysts and analysis is not well integrated into policing now. Part of it comes down to training, because if it's the case, let's say, for instance, that your analyst is only knowledgeable about how to generate statistics, that's only hitting the surface of really what an analyst does. The more that they get training and the more that they develop their skill set, the better an analyst they're going to be, and the more integrated they're going to be in a policing culture.
Now, what would you consider success in crime analysis? And are you willing to share your best success story?
Yeah, for me, I think at the very beginning of my career, I would need to kind of look back to see where I was, because it's the only way that I can really reflect on really what my successes are. In the past, I felt as though like I was obviously the first patrol analyst for all of patrol. And the frustrating part about that was the fact that it was a very, very new position. So it was not well introduced to my agency. That's definitely grown over time, and it's substantially better to this day. The reason why I feel as though it's a success, though, is because of influence. And I guess the biggest thing for me as an analyst is being able to produce something that actually eventually makes change. And to have people listen to what I do, and to also tap into my expertise, and to not just say John's just that stats guy that sits in the corner, they recognize, you know what, John has a bunch of different skill sets, and let's challenge him to do different things. And I'll give you a prime success story. So my current supervisor is an acting inspector, but him and I have a really good working relationship. And the way it started was actually because he was the sergeant for break and enter. And we had revitalized our break and enter strategy team simply by having conversations about, you know, what was going on at the table. And we both recognized some of the frustrations that we were mutually feeling. But then him and I started having these conversations, and he said to me, you know, let's talk about, you know, what we can do to revamp this table. And I introduced to him this concept of evidence-based policing, and also about tactical bulletins, tactical crime analysis bulletins. And these are the bread and butter of what crime analysts do. So the first bulletin that I created for him, he was blown out of the water by that. Like, he had no idea that this thing existed. The second thing is that he had asked me to put together like intel packages for him, including like association charts, backgrounds on individuals, and seeing how they're all connected to each other. He had never seen anything like that before. So when we brought these individual packages to the break and enter strategy team, we drove the table from simply talking about people to being intelligence led. And that to me was very successful. And like I said, as a consequence of that, I feel as though we've set the standard for our agency, and it's definitely having a rippling effect in terms of what we're doing.
That's outstanding. The first time we worked together was on the IACA International Symposium Committee in Halifax. Tell us about your new role as chair of the IACA Publications Committee.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm actually really, really privileged to be part of this team, because I've been part of the IACA ever since I started out as a law enforcement analyst. And so I really wanted to ensure that I was consistently active, and, you know, part of my strength is about research. And so I naturally found my way into the former Standards, Methods, and Technology Committee. And at that point, I was helping to write these different methods white papers. And, you know, I'd written papers on like hotspot policing, and on social network analysis, and on prioritizing offenders. So all topics that I absolutely love talking about. But my role moving into the publications chair position, what I wanted to do was revamp in terms of like what we were doing as a publications committee, because the publications committee is known for developing our textbook and for publishing these white papers. And I thought that that was fantastic. But my experience with the Canadian Society of Evidence-Based Policing, part of our strength for CanCEP was the ability to harness different pieces of media. So we wanted to look at, you know, webcasts and podcasts, and different infographics, for instance. So different types of media where we could share pieces of information. So my initial kind of kick at the can as chair was obviously identifying what our vision was and what our mission was. And basically the bottom line of what I want to do for the publications committee was to become a resource for analysts, for the public, to police leaders, to understand our profession better, and to provide them with information that would be evidence-based, and provide them with research in a more consumable way. So in some sense, there's a bit of overlap, but what it did was it brought in the scope of what our publications committee is committed to do. So what we've got on the go right now is we've got plans to revamp our the current textbook to ensure that what's in there is current and it's well published. We also want to change that into like an ebook version, so then we can end up distributing that to a wider audience, because we know that, you know, obviously funding for police agencies isn't the greatest all over the world. So if we could create different opportunities for different police agencies to get access to that stuff, really that's kind of where we want to move towards. The other exciting piece is that we've got a subcommittee that's focused on producing our newsletter. And recently, one of our committee members had sent out a survey about really what matters to our members. And that's kind of really what I wanted to do, was open up that communication between our membership and our committee, because really we're here to be a resource, like I said, for our membership and for the broader community. So that's kind of where we're heading towards, is looking at different pieces of media. And the other thing, speaking of media, we're planning to hopefully have a social media presence specifically for our publications committee, because we don't have time to wait for, a publication to come out every quarter to send out information. So what I'm really hoping for is to capitalize on social media. So that'll be the next bit where we can send stuff out, like little nuggets of information about policing, about crime analysis, and about research that's going on right now.
Those are great initiatives. Congratulations on your recent appointment as Director of Operations at CanCEP. How did that come about? And tell us about your new role and your current projects.
Yeah, for sure. It was actually really, really exciting. It was slightly odd because I had met Dr. Laura Huey, who's the former executive director and founder of CanCEP, a few years back at a policing conference. And I can't exactly remember how we struck up conversation exactly, but I remember us having dinner at one point, and I remember commenting to her. This was at a police leaders conference, and it was about research. And I had said to her, where are all the crime analysts in this room? And because all I saw were academics and I saw police leaders, and I thought this was great. They were talking about research and they've got police leaders there. But I was sitting there as one of a handful of crime analysts there, and it really caught me off guard. So I said to Dr. Laura Huey, I said, this is really bizarre that, we don't have crime analysts here. So fast forward probably, I'm going to say 3-4 years down the road after we had that first initial meeting. And I noticed that CanCEP had a very strong social media presence. And at that time, I had taken some time off, and I just started reading a lot about policing research. And when I was a grad student, several years back, I had no idea the level of policing research that existed. So I started jumping into a lot of policing research type stuff, and I was going nuts over Twitter, in terms of what I was pushing out there. And I think gradually over time, it got people's attention because it was really, really interesting stuff. So that's when I reached out to CanCEP and I said, hey, can I join your team? And they said, you know what, you seem to be really, really strong at social media stuff. So I said, you know what, I'll go ahead and be part of your social media stuff. And so they asked me, can you carve out a section for crime analysts? Because I feel as though they've got a very strong role and a key role in evidence-based policing. And I said, this is a fantastic opportunity. So as I was starting to become, kind of the analyst series coordinator, we started creating an analyst series day every Tuesday, I think it was, or Thursday for CanCEP on Twitter. And it was wildly popular. And I apologize to the listeners in terms of the folks who follow me on Twitter. Obviously, I've been busy with my new role with CanCEP, but I do plan to continue on with this crime analysis series. And the purpose of that series was to develop and create an understanding about the parallels between evidence-based policing and crime analysis. And then that's when I started moving into my role of Director of Operations. The reason why I guess I stepped into this role was because Dr. Laura Huey stepped away from this, and she's been very vocal in terms of why she was stepping away. But she had full trust in myself and my counterparts. So Inspector Rich Johnson with the Barrie Police Service, Sergeant Nick Bell with the West Vancouver Police Department, and then with Maria Wright with the London Police Service, and then also with Stan McClellan with the Durham Regional Police. So all of us are directors and chairs for CanCEP, moving CanCEP forward. And my day-to-day kind of, or my role with CanCEP right now is to start building CanCEP, the new future of CanCEP. So we revitalized what our mission and what our vision was, what our goals were. And so our main 3 areas that we're planning to focus on over the next few years is in communication. So that's including our social media and our newsletters. Education, which includes training and different tools. So for instance, infographics. And then the last piece is about research. And really the research piece, the reality is that we're not research experts, but we are there to make connections if needed. So if any audience members really wants to get involved with research, or needs help getting started somehow, we're definitely people that you can reach out to. The research component for CanCEP will be about developing our Canadian Elite Scholars Program and our Virtual Scholars Program. And both of those programs really are about encouraging police officers and civilian members to get involved with research. So we, specifically for the Virtual Scholars Program, we invite them to be part of our program, and then we connect them with a Canadian researcher in policing, and they work together towards a project together. And in many cases, one of the key kind of stipulations behind being part of the Virtual Scholars Program is coming up with presentations and publications. And our recent scholars from 2020, they're kind of in that process of publishing. So these are police officers that are engaging in research, and they're publishing on it, which is exactly kind of the mission, the new mission for CanCEP. So yeah, that's kind of my role with CanCEP right now.
How would a police agency engage with CanCEP, and what can they expect as far as support?
Yeah, I think right now we're just in the process, actually, to be quite honest, in terms of like growing CanCEP right now. We're laying the foundation as to kind of where we want to go down the road. But in terms of like getting involved with CanCEP, I would encourage them to reach out to us, because I think down the road, one of the things we absolutely want to do, and the strengths behind CanCEP, is the partnerships that we end up having. And really, we're volunteer based. So any agency that wants to come and connect with us, we would be very, very happy in terms of bringing them on and allowing them to kind of have a voice at like what we're doing down the road. So in terms of the support that they can end up getting, my main thing for them would be in terms of helping them, let's say, promote evidence-based policing in their agency. So it might be, can you tell us a little bit more about like hotspots policing or evidence-based policing as a whole? Can you provide us like training on this? How can our officers get involved with research? Those kind of things is kind of what they would potentially expect coming from us in the future.
In your recent Neuro Knowledge interview, you spoke greatly about hotspot analysis. Can you explain what hotspot analysis is?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I could definitely go back in terms of like, it kind of goes down along the same lines as really what you're expecting your analyst to do. And it's almost equivalent to like asking your analyst to just produce statistics for you. They could definitely put together like a pretty chart or a pretty map for you with all the dots on it. And that's fantastic. But really, the map doesn't tell you anything. It's more than just creating all these different maps. It's really about the problem solving that really comes about afterwards. And it's about the analysis that comes afterwards to identify, first things first is identifying really what the problem is, if there is a problem in the first place. And then from there, you start moving into, the different phases of problem-oriented policing. And so part of that may come down to identifying, where the hotspots are. But at that point, you start looking at some of the contributing factors behind, what's causing all of these dots to show up on the map. And that's really where the hard work starts to show up. But in addition to that, it's important to consider the hotspot research that's going on out there, because hotspot policing isn't simply about putting officers on dots. It's about what officers do at those hotspots that really make a difference. And there's plenty of literature out there that identifies what are best practices and effective practices for police agencies when they're trying to engage in hotspot policing.
In your view, what is the biggest challenge in moving the policing culture to apply a more evidence-based model?
Um, I- I'm just going to speak specifically about Canada, but I think in some senses, like there's definitely evidence-based policing societies all over the world, and I see that there's definitely certain countries that are well ahead of Canada. Part of the reason behind that is because it's exactly what Dr. Laura Huey has mentioned before in previous talks that she's had, and it's simply identifying that there's a huge lack of high-quality research in Canadian policing research. And part of that comes down to, the funding that we end up getting versus, places like the US and the UK, where they get, massive amounts of money through NIJ, through different organizations in their own countries. We don't have something that's equally as equivalent in Canada. We don't have like a version of the NIJ that has, tons of money for policing research. And there's only a handful of like policing scholars that are within Canada. Like a lot of them are critical criminologists, not like applied policing scholars. So I've naturally gravitated towards Dr. Laura Huey, and so that's one of the reasons why I think, or that's one of the barriers to moving us forward in terms of becoming more evidence-based. But because of that kind of recency in terms of the lack of research, what that also says is that there's an infancy in terms of where policing is in Canada to understand what evidence-based policing is. And I could almost guarantee that a lot of my EBP advocates, if we start going into a room of police officers and start talking about research evidence and telling them that, random patrols is not going to be effective in reducing crime, and, all these other things that we know based off of evidence is not going to be effective, we're going to be like, people are going to start giving us like side looks, because clearly it's not something that's part of common knowledge and common language right now. But that's kind of my hope, is to bring forward that knowledge and to make sure that that language is not foreign to people. Like, people should be talking in police meetings to say, well, you know what, actually the research evidence demonstrate that that's not true, and this is actually what's effective. And people should not be like, that guy sounds like an academic, like he has no idea what he's talking about. Like, I don't want us to go down that path. Really, academia and evidence-based and research has a substantial role in terms of where policing needs to be going forward in the 21st century, especially if you look at the crises that we're facing in all over the world. In Canada, there is nowhere else and no better time for evidence-based policing to show up.
Where do you see crime analysis in the next few years?
I would really hope that, and this is not to necessarily knock on where policing is right now in terms of, being more investigative and more tactical. Like, I'm a tactical analyst. Like, my day in, day out job is being a tactical analyst. But really, where I feel as though there is an imbalance, and I think some folks have pointed this out, is that there's an imbalance between the strategic crime analysis that needs to get done and the tactical stuff. And the tactical stuff is great in terms of, like, obviously locking up the bad guys and identifying crime series and helping investigators. I think that's all great, and we absolutely need to have that kind of approach to that. But we do need to focus in on, in some cases, like the preventative aspects of it, like to identify really what works in policing. So then we're not being so reactive all the time. So I feel as though the field of crime analysis, I'm hoping that, potentially at IACA conferences, that we'll see more research coming out at some of those conferences. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping for in the next few years for crime analysis. And I'm hoping that, we can kind of push forward with that on the CanCEP side.
Well, I hope you get there. What do you find most rewarding about your work as a crime analyst? What's your goal, and how will you know when you get there?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest kind of um, thoughts behind success for me is whether or not, like, I'm influential in my police agency, whether or not, like, the things that I do is making an impact. Because we sit there at a desk all day and we just, some folks might feel as though, crime analysts just sit there and look at numbers all day. But really, we're not there. We're passionate about what we do. We have the exact same passion that many people who get into policing have. We want to make our community safer. We just do it in a different kind of way. We use analysis to help police agencies do better work and to make our community safer. So for me, success means being able to influence my agency. But that being said, also, success also means to me that I read something recently, and I'll say it again, like I've said on Neuro Knowledge, is that crime analysis historically has been about supporting policing, whereas really in my perspective, it should be about guiding policing. So that's kind of where I see crime analysis being influential, being at the driving kind of position in policing and not just kind of sitting on the sidelines. So for me, my goal would be to hopefully kind of get to that point, and I can see definitely bright lights in many agencies, including mine, that are definitely moving along that path. And as leadership begins to change, we can definitely see that, they're definitely grasping towards more evidence-based and intelligence-led policing, which is fantastic to see. For myself down the road, what I would love to see is for analysts to develop their skill set beyond simply, the 19 different skill sets that the IACA kind of educates them about. And that's kind of one of my main reasons for being part of the Publications Committee, is to look at the skill sets that we currently have and to see what else we need to supplement that with.
Now, what advice would you have for anyone looking to get into crime analysis?
Yeah, I get that question quite a lot, especially from like educators and students that are really wanting to get into crime analysis work, and they're asking what courses should I take, what degrees should I be having, et cetera, et cetera. I think the most important thing is to have definitely like good work experience, regardless of whatever you're doing. Get yourself involved with research, whatever it might look like, and have a social science background. That's all that I would mainly say. Because for me, I started out in academia. I worked for public health agencies and different organizations. My background, again, was in psychology, so that's kind of what I was moving towards. But because of my strength in analysis, simply because of my social science background, I started doing a lot of evaluation type work. And that's where I ended up being hired by the police service that I work with as one of the research coordinators. Is my strength was in evaluation. So really, you can pick up a lot of these different skill sets as you move forward in your career. But in terms of, having the fundamentals, having a social science background, ensuring that your research skills are up to par, I would definitely join different associations, including the IACA and with CanCEP. Just so then you can stay in the loop in terms of, what's relevant. So then the day that, you do get called in for an interview, you can explain to them, what you currently know about crime analysis. And part of it comes down to also reaching out to analysts like myself, figuring out, whether or not there's internship opportunities. And I know that there's some universities and colleges that offer internships. So I think that that's definitely an opportunity that's there. And I think just as an idea for police agencies wanting to develop their crime analysis unit, I would absolutely start with interns. So if you have the opportunity to get, an intern to kind of help you out, you've got like a prime opportunity to have a person that you don't need to think about whether or not that person's qualified to be a good crime analyst, because they've already got the opportunity to train under a senior analyst. So that's kind of what I would advise for both people wanting to get into and folks who want to hire like high quality analysts.
That's great advice. How can we find out more about joining CanCEP, and how would folks get a hold of you?
Yeah, for sure. So they can definitely find me on Twitter. That's kind of where I'm mainly found. So if you just type in the Google, you could type in Twitter and then type in John Ing and CanCEP, you can definitely find me. It's pretty easy. The CanCEP website is can-sebp.net. And it's a free membership. So we're gradually, we've got plenty of resources that are on our website. It's a free membership, like I said, and on the background, there's plenty of resources. There's articles that you can read. There's infographics, there's webcasts, there's podcasts that are all on there. And again, like our team is constantly trying to create brand new tools. That again is one of our fundamental pillars, our major areas of work moving into the future. So yeah, it's a free membership. So I would definitely encourage folks to join. And we've got our newsletters that are coming out every quarter. So you get to see kind of really what's going on in Canadian evidence-based policing.
It's been a great interview. Any last words, John?
No, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to connecting with people who reach out to me.
Well, I appreciate your insights, John. Thanks for some of your time, and I hope you'll come back and join us again.
Thanks again, man.
That's John Ng, CanCEP Director, Certified Crime Analyst, Researcher, and friend. If you found value in this video, smash that like, click subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss any of our episodes. See you next time.